Hi, everyone. This is Tori Vandelin with Prevent Connect. This podcast is part 3 of a 3-part series where Susan Gondreport interviews Amy Thompson to discuss close to home as a community-driven approach to violence prevention.
That it takes time and it can feel slow in the beginning. And especially because we're in a very action-oriented sort of, okay, what did you do? What are your metrics? Environment. And so how do we value like sitting and having coffee with somebody, even though we may not see the fruits of that, right, relationship for months down the road. Yeah.
So that's really intriguing to me because different contexts may have different values, right? So I'm really curious, as you've seen this work go out into other places, like other parts of Massachusetts, other parts, of California, are there parts where you feel like, okay, some of these values are really core, and if it doesn't have, like you just talked about, for example, having this deep trust and faith and belief that communities have the answers, have the solutions, and are an integral part of any kind of work that gets done, right? So maybe have you thought about some of the values that seem really core in order to really think of it as a close to home kind of approach, versus things where you've seen adaptations happen that maybe you hadn't expected, but were just based on sort of context, because you had sort of a unique position where you were really rooted in your community for a time.
Yeah.
Once it starts hitting like Department of Public Health level, sometimes the people who come in are people like me, right? Like I'm maybe not part of that community, although I maybe have some of those values, those core values. And how have you seen that kind of shifting, or what's been going on with that from you?
Yeah. Well, I think that there are a range of variables that would affect how this would play out in different contexts. I think that one major one is the organization that decides to give it a try. I feel like, and so whether or not that organization is in the community, that like physically in the community where it's going to happen, whether the staff that are on the project know that community well or are from the community, those are all things that could affect it. If the organization, needs to partner with another organization to actually have connections to community members, that affects it and creates more layers. So I feel like those are some of the variables that we've seen, and that it just really depends on the sort of stance of both the organization and the staff person that's in the role. And then whether the staff person is supported to be out there and really doing that deep engagement work, I think that we've partnered with some really amazing organizations that already had really strong community engagement processes in place. And then if that's true, then like, is an approach like close to home necessary? I think is a question, right? If there's already strong work happening, like, is it needed to layer in yet another community engagement approach, or what's the value add of that? I think is something interesting to think about. So I think those are some of the things that have come up. And then I think there have been other organizations that just really weren't in a place where it kind of were maybe excited about the idea of it, but then maybe just weren't ready to make all the shifts that were needed, it would have just taken a little bit more time and preparation, and maybe a little more buy-in for that to be possible. So yeah, all good learning, right?
Yeah, totally. That's really interesting. Because part of what I think about is, like people's readiness to do just sort of what you were saying, right?
Yeah.
And does that readiness look like the core values are in place, or like the relationships are in place? What have you given some thought to, like, okay, if you're going to plant this program, here's some of the things that you really need to be in your soil for it to thrive.
Right. I think that I feel like it's probably some of the core values in the closed home tools. We talk about this set of 9 principles that feel like a critical set of glasses, like, through which to view the work, that really help, right? And then I think that it helps for sure to have some good key relationships. And I feel like if the commitment is there to build those, that can come. But I do think, like, sustained investment in a relationship in a particular community setting is really helpful. Just because I feel like, because of our short grant cycles, and that nonprofits are often in and out of community contexts. And I think that the sustained relationship is so important. Like, there's some integrity piece there for me about, like, actually kind of really deeply walking the talk shoulder to shoulder, with folks that were in, like, I mean, it's why I did my work where I lived, right? Because it was like, okay, we're gonna live this. And like, it just, yeah, there's a lot to say about that, but
And I'm sure,
yeah.
do wonder, is that something that has actually shown up now that California has, so you said, like 3 cycles of it? Is there a way in which, like, even in how they do their RFPs or something about, are they asking more intentional questions about that, or like asking for more, like, not proof, but just like more, like explanation within people who are looking to apply for this kind of funding, to really demonstrate these deeper connections? Is that something that's happened?
Yes, the definitely over the 3 cycles, I think that I've been involved in just helping shape the questions just a little bit. I'm not part of the review at all, but I think that we've gotten clear about both saying this is what kind of needs to be in place. This is what it takes. And then, yes, asking those questions. Yeah. And then I think having more conversations with folks about, this is really what it takes. And it's actually not easy. And it's worth it, but it's definitely, it is a shift. It's very different. It's just very different than a curriculum based approach, which there's power in too, right? But there's just something different about it, and a mobilization and a community driven approach in particular, than some of the other ways that we do prevention.
Yes, I was going to say, one thing that really strikes me about this is that there's a lot of generative components to it. There's a lot of, like, to what emerges, and really growing those things that emerge,
Yeah.
rather than having in mind like a set playbook. I mean,
Right.
is that how you feel? Yeah.
That is a very well said. And then it's also one of the shifts, right, that people have to be comfortable with.
Right.
And because it can be very disorienting to be like, oh, I'm actually facilitating a process, and I have to trust the process. And I can, I can question the process, and that's okay, right? We want critical thinking all the time. It's not like blindly, but that there is a method. Like, there's a method. There's a reason we go through these processes, because it does generate something ideal, like, hopefully, right? And and that something is community voice, community leadership, deep relationships, right? All of those things that can help us shift these norms, and creative ideas that we could never think of, right? Like, that's what's so fun about this, is that there are surprises, and like these beautiful gems that, I mean, I feel like, again, in the spirit of sort of entrepreneurial, kind of emergent stuff, that there were times along the way where there was an idea that bubbled up, and I was really like, I'm not sure about that. And, thank goodness there were times that happened and I didn't say anything because I was wrong. Right. They were actually amazing ideas and led to amazing things. And it's sort of like, yeah, let's just see. Right. Because maybe something beautiful is going to come out of this.
Right.
I can't see,
That sense of experimentation also feels really baked into this to me, because I think a lot of times, especially for us in this field, it feels so high stakes. So then having experimentation feels really risky,
Right.
and maybe something to be avoided, right? It's like, well, I don't want to try it and then it doesn't work because, oh my goodness, lives are at stake, kind of thing.
Right.
And so I'm curious, like, were people kind of willing to lean into that, and just like, what happened if something failed? Like, were people letting it go? Where did that, how was that negotiated?
Yeah, I think that that there has been a lot of leaning in to taking, creative risks. Obviously, we would not take safety risks, and there's lots of conversation about that. And so I think that, there are so many examples, right? Because there have been so many different sites that have done different things. There have been times when ideas have come up where an organization would be like, I actually really don't know if we can legitimately do this. And so then it requires dialogue, right? Like peer-to-peer dialogue. Okay, here's why this may not work. And so, okay, then here's how we'll shift it so it will, so I feel like those kinds of, but that's authentic, right? Authentic peer negotiation, like figuring out how can this happen. And then I feel like there are I have a close colleague who calls them fabulous flops, right? Yeah. All the time. Like in organizing, like how many times does it happen that we work really hard to get people together for something and one person comes or nobody comes and you've got 20 pizzas and a salad? I just feel like it's part of it. So then I think another thing that I feel like is so important, and I can think so many examples of the work in California where then there's a pause, right, with community members to say, okay, what can we learn from this? Like, what can we learn from this, failure? And okay, what does it mean about how we're engaging folks, or what time we're meeting, or where we're meeting, or whether or not we have childcare, all of those things that just help us make the work better and deeper and more real. So
I love this kind of constant, continuous feedback that you all are doing, or that's sort of baked in, right? Because I think a lot of times people get really intimidated by the evaluation and assessment part, and they feel like it has to be like a 20, question survey or whatever. And what I love about, like you spoke, previously about the pluses and deltas, which is just a simple thing like what worked, what was great, what would you change, the end, right? It's very easy to have that, at the end, whatever conversation, and then really saying, okay, we collected just a small amount of information, but we're really going to be intentional about integrating it back. My evaluator research heart loves that so much. So I know I could talk about this forever. I've really been enjoying this conversation. I do know that we can maybe wrap up. So one thing I would just like to know is sort of, where do you see this work going? Where do you see your involvement or connection to this work? Like when you think about it, like your vision about close to home, what do you see? What do you see?
Yeah. Oh, that's such a great question. Well, I think that as I've shared, and as folks can read in some of the documents, that close to home, the organization no longer exists, right? We did our work in Boston, and it was, and then just decided that the organizational form was so hard to maintain that we decided to to actually close that. And so the work in locally was merged, and local neighbors have continued that to some extent. And then the California Department of Public Health has continued it. So I feel really excited about what's happening in California right now. It's so exciting to see the work happening in different places in different contexts. And it's really incredibly fortunate that the public health department has played the leadership role that it has in supporting this kind of community-driven approach, in partnership with Blue Cross Blue Shield in California to some extent, like for one of the cycles of funding. And so I feel like that's really exciting. I think that, again, it's the principles of the work of community mobilization and community organizing related to this that are so exciting to me. And I know that there are a lot of communities across the country that have resources to do it, or just doing it on their own, are trying different ways to engage community members to develop solutions to these violences and others. And so, I mean, I have so much excitement about that. And I just feel like there's so much learning we can all do from each other. And I feel like it would be so exciting for us to have more of a conversation about the role of community in this work. And not only in the work specifically, of course, to prevent domestic and sexual violence, but I also just feel like in the work to build community right now, to build community towards the world we want right now, feels like such an important conversation to have. And so so it's something I'm thinking about, like what could that look like, and how could we lean into that a little bit more? And I feel like all the folks that are doing prevention have such an important contribution to make to that conversation, right? Because all of us have experience doing community work. And addressing domestic and sexual violence is such an important part of moving into the world that we want. And this sort of emerging worldview that, and how do we get there in a way that is sort of, that builds the bigger we, and then still addresses and, really addresses all of the different forms of violence that are happening right now in this current context.
Right, that's right. I was really struck by how close to home it sees domestic violence and sexual violence as part of a pattern of violence, or part of that sort of patchwork, that quilt of violence that is showing up, I would say, increasingly, right? Right.
Yeah.
Well, is there any big takeaway that you would give to our audience about close to home, especially for folks who maybe this is the first time they've heard about it, or they've been, curious about it?
Yeah. Well, I just think, just to explore and try, and and there are so many good people that are. That would be willing to be in thought partnership if that would be helpful, whether it's me or some of the other folks in California that are, that are doing this, and that we just want to invite people to really explore what this could mean in their communities, whether it's this approach or what any community-driven approach, right? We think that there are we've learned a lot of things in this that we found to be really helpful, and there are many paths. So,
Right. Well, what a wonderful way to end, and I wish it didn't have to end. I've really been enjoying this conversation. It could have gone for several more hours. But I hope that the Prevent Connect audience enjoys it, and we are going to, list all of those resources. One great thing about Close to Home being around for a while is that you all have produced a lot of documentation and a lot of, guides and information about the different ways it can be practiced and those core principles and the phases. I think that's all really a really valuable toolkit for people who, need like a little bit of sort of structure or like a sort of a playbook, right? To help them think about how to launch. So thank you so much.
Thank you. It's been very fun.
Thanks for listening. Want to engage deeper with this podcast? Check out the Prevent Connect e-learning course based on this interview. A link is provided on this podcast page on our website.